All right. Excuse me. Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, verse by verse and chapter by chapter through the entire Bible. And we are in Luke's Gospel, chapter 15. And what a wonderful story I'm going to unpack. Jesus is telling a parable. Now, to understand the parable, we need to understand, as I said, chapters 15 and 15 and 16. Chapters 15 and 16, and part of in the beginning of 17, really is based upon the first verse of 15, that the Pharisees criticized Jesus eating with sinners. They said, so keep this in mind, that all of the parables in chapters 15 and 16 in the beginning of 17 is Jesus addressing that criticism. And so the first two parables were about a man a shepherd who, if one sheep gets lost, he leaves the 99 and he goes in search for that lost sheep until he finds it. And then he called his friends and says, "Rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep." And I just want to say this about true shepherds, um, and in terms of churches, that a lot of pastors, a lot of pastors will not search for lost members. In fact, a lot of them will get offended if you leave their church. And the idea is they take the other parable to Jesus, so they shake the dust off. They will not come. But that shows they do not have the heart of God that God has towards his people. But I digress. So I saved this here last time for the last time. I said, well, rather than get into it, I want to unpack it. And then, of course, he tells the other parable about the 10 coins. The lady lost a precious coin. She searches for it until she finds it. Now, let me go back to verse 1 so that you can keep in mind. This is what what Jesus is talking about in these chapters. He says, all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and all the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So keep this in mind. This is what this is about. Now in verse 11, this is the famous prodigal son. The story of the prodigal son. And here's the interesting thing. This parable is not about the prodigal son, but about the older son who is jealous, who is angry at the attention of the prodigal son. So that's what it's about. Remember, in the first verse, you have the the Pharisees criticizing Jesus. Now, when you look at an Old Testament, when you look at an Old Testament analogy, the Gentiles represent a younger son, and then Israel represents the older son. And so when he says here about criticizing the Pharisees who criticize sinners, again, to keep the analogy. So verse 11 says, he also said a man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So he distributed the assets, now get this, to them. Now that's going to be important later on. I am going to break down the analogy of the story about the prodigal son. You have to do that because there's some precious truth here revealing the father's love. So verse 13 says, not many days later, the youngest son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. Now, this is what the word prodigal means, wastefulness. So the prodigal son was the wasteful son, he wasted. Verse 14, after he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. And then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to eat his fill from the carob pods the pigs were eating, but no one would give him any. Now, what's interesting about this here is you see he goes from his prideful ways, right? He goes from prideful ways, demanding money from his father. And father gives it to him, divided his assets up. And then he takes it and he squanders it like a fool. There's a lot of times there's people that are fools. You give a fool money and they will waste it. You know that if you gave people $1 million, and if you gave people $1 million, most of the people would squander it within 5 minutes. If you took all of the money from rich people, and you gave it to everybody else, took all the money from rich people and you gave it to everybody else, gave all of their wealth. You hear a lot about distribution of wealth. You hear that language, and sometimes these are just they're silly language. Just like when you hear defund the police, defund the police. They're silly slogans. I mean, and they miss the mark, right? Because no one. I've seen people who are advocates, architects of the phrase defund the police, call for the police when they got cornered, got in trouble. The same thing. If you take all the money from the wealthy people and you gave it to everybody else, the rich people within 5 years would get it all back because they're wealthy for a reason, and people are not wealthy for a reason. But anyway, so you see this. He takes it and he spends it. It's kind of interesting because he was around everybody, and he was the life of the town because he was spending money. And then when he exhausted all of his wealth, then he became a pauper. He became poor. Now, what's interesting, of course, is the analogy that Jesus is giving is that then after he spent everything, a severe famine struck the country and he had nothing. He ended up working for one of the citizens of that country. Now, here is the interesting thing. From a Jewish perspective, he ended up working feeding pigs. And if anybody, of course, know, pigs is a big no-no in Jewish customs. Forbidden food. Why? Because pigs they're foul animals. They are. And here he is reduced to feeding pigs. And then worse, he cannot even eat the same kind of foods as pigs. So not only now that he has he's been reduced to being around a forbidden food, a food that I'm gonna look up this word, karab. Not only looking let's see here. Not only is he um, okay, I just kind of had to look up Karab pod, which is a a a plant. Okay, it is a plant. Okay, all right. These pods were used to make chips. All right, so that's what they were feeding the pigs. It was a kind of a plant. Okay, in the Mediterranean area. All right. Now, but here's the point. He couldn't even eat that. He couldn't even eat the pods that he was feeding the pigs. And then he says, and no one would give him anything. So that's the picture there. He's humble. He went from being proud and arrogant. And by the way, a lot of children are like this way. They get pride. And if your child is proud, then you let God work in their heart. But if you, for example, if the father came to his rescue, and notice you don't hear from the father had means. He could have searched out and found the son, but no, you notice God worked in his heart. Watch this. Verse 17 says, and when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food? Now that kind of signified his father was a benevolent master. Okay. How many of my father's hired hands, his servants, have more than enough food to eat, and I'm here dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of the hired hands. So here's an astounding turn of events. Here is what you would call humility. That he says, I'm not even worthy to be called my father's son. I'm not worthy to be his son. I'm just going to go beg to say, just let me be like one of the servants. That's humble. And by the way, this is how you should allow God to humble wayward kids. And by the way, for that fact, anyone, there's a humbleness that should occur. So he says, verse 20, so he got up and he went to his father. Now, this was something interesting because he was weak. Remember, he was malnutritioned. So he had to muster the strength to go to his father. So he got up and he went to his father. And while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. Now, here's the interesting thing. He probably was wondering, how is my father going to respond to me? How is my father, will he reject me? I spoke harshly to him. I spoke arrogantly to him. How would he treat me? How would he treat me? But here is the interesting thing. He says, well, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? And he humbled himself and says, well, I can only try. And that's the humbleness, the humility that people should show. But his father saw him from a distance. Now get this. He ran. There's a beautiful song that I'm trying to find that came out, I think in the 80s. Yes, I'm dating myself. The Christian song. And I think the title or one of the verses was When God Ran. Okay. He says he ran and threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Imagine the tears in his father's eyes, right? And the tears in his father's eyes, because one, his son came back, but then not only did his son come back, but he came back a humbled son. He came back a humble son. So he says, but the father told his slaves, quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. So by the time he came, he didn't even have shoes. Okay. And then he says, then bring out the fatted calf and slaughter it. And let's celebrate with the feast, because this son of mine was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. So they begin to celebrate. Now, so this part of the parable is so rich in revealing God, that God's heart towards us. So notice that in the Father's eyes, he never lost his son. He was, you could say, backslidden, but he was always the son. And let that truth sink in. Even though he had arrogantly walked away from the Father, notice how the Father saw him, that he was always the son. And notice he says, bring out a robe and a ring and put it on. Now, the term, the son of mine was dead and is alive, what did he mean? The figurative, the word death means to be separated, to be alienated from. And so, in other words, his son was alienated from God. I mean, from his father. So that's why he said he was dead, because he what? He walked away. He alienated himself from me. And then he says, but now he's alive. He was lost and he was found. What was he lost? He lost in his sin. And he was found. And how was he found? Because think about this. He came to his senses. He came to his senses. He was lost, but then he came to his senses. And the most beautiful thing is his father was like, when he said to him, make me as one of your servants, you kind of almost can visualize away with that thought. And here is his son. And watch this. He was restored as his son. Wealth and all. He was restored as his son, wealth and all. Now, you also get a picture of how wealthy the father was, that he gave the money, but guess what? The father still was wealthy. That he was as wealthy. He was never broke. He never. And by the way, think about this. Even though there was a famine around, his father was still wealthy. So the son walked away without the wisdom of the father. But notice that the restoration of the son was never in question to the father. And of course, this reflects the heart of God, that God, we are always and that's believers. And I will say this, which I'm not going to get into here. We are never lost to God, because Jesus, well, let me put it this way. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 22, he says that though we were alienated and enemies in our minds by our wicked works, yet Jesus reconciled us to God through his death, through his body, and he presented us holy, blameless, and without fault before him. So God, that's how God looks at us through Jesus, eternally as his sons. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section. Add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.